5.1 is our Introduction to Statistics. We're going to look at sampling and study methods. So our first thought is throughout this unit, we'll be examining and working with data. And so data we can think of as numbers, information, or something we're gathering. There are various methods to obtain data. So this means that there are many ways to gather information. In this objective, we will look at a few of these methods and what, if any, bias could be associated with them. And so here we see this word bias, and so we're going to define it. What is bias? What does that mean? Well, bias happens when, and I'm going to go ahead and write down the definition, and then we can talk about it. So bias happens when a certain characteristic or flaw in the sampling process results in data favoring a particular result. So something happens and a certain outcome is favored. That is what bias is. Let's go ahead and look at one of our first ways to gather information. The first one is a random sample. So we're going to randomly select a group of people or whatever we're going to look at. And this is the best. Our overall goal when we're trying to collect information is obviously to have an unbiased survey or sample. And this can only be accomplished with a random sample or survey. This isn't easy to accomplish, as you may think. Let's say I needed to select 5 students. If I close my eyes and just randomly pointed at 5 people, that's not random. There are some conscious and unconscious biases going on. A truly random sample or survey takes away any judgment on the part of the person doing the selecting. So here's a couple ways. Put everyone's name in a hat, draw 5 names. Or use a computer with a random number generator to select the group. I want you to go ahead and read the next little scenario. I want you to think about who we're taking people from, so our overall population, and our sample, and our bias. So go ahead and just read it, and then we'll talk about the answers to the next questions. Okay, so let's read it together. Every student in the room would have a code corresponding to their position on my class roster. The first student would be assigned 1, and the last student would be assigned 34. So we're randomly numbering the students. We would program the computer to select a certain number of people using the random number generator program. So this first question is asking what the population is. Population is the overall group we are picking from. So what is the overall group we're picking from? Well, we're picking from the 34 students. The sample is the specific group we are asking. And who are we asking? Well, we picked, let's go back up to this idea, we picked 5 names. So the 5 students selected. And with random, there's no bias. Let's go ahead and look at systematic. And this one is good if done right. If the person who is selecting the sample or survey follows a defined pattern for the selection. So we're following a defined pattern. The sample is a systematic sample. So here's a little example. The president of an amusement park is curious as to whether customers think it was a good idea to spend millions of dollars on a brand new roller coaster. It is the first day of operations for the new roller coaster, and the line is a 2-hour wait. To survey the park guests, he asks every 20th person in line waiting to ride the roller coaster. So systematic is we have a pattern. What's our pattern here? Every 20th person. Go ahead and I want you to fill out what you think the population is. So what is our overall group? What is the sample? What is the specific group we're asking? And then what could there be any bias? For population, hopefully we got something like all the park guests. Our sample is every 20th person because that's who we're asking. We're asking every 20th person. What is an example of a bias here? Well, they're the ones waiting in line, so they'll probably say it's good. If they didn't think it was good, they wouldn't wait in line. Okay, let's go ahead and look at convenience sample. This is our next one. And this one is bad. As the title implies, a convenience method of sampling is where you create a quick or easy sampling technique. Go ahead and read through the example and pick out what is our population, sample, and what could some bias be. Go ahead and pause the video so that they can do this. Now that you've had time to read it and think about it, let's read it together. Let's say the school's principal wants to randomly survey students and get their opinion regarding whether or not soda should be allowed to be sold on campus during the school day. Each counselor is given 20 surveys to hand out during lunch. One counselor decides to pick a classroom by one of the exit doors and hands the surveys out to students who come out of that classroom when the bell rings. They've given out their surveys in less than 1 minute. So, what is our population? Our population is, we're wanting to ask all the students at the school. And what's the sample? Well, we know there's 20 surveys, and they give it to one classroom. What is some bias? Well, the type of class could have some bias. There's lots of bias there. The type of class, maybe they're all kind of under the same opinion because it could be like a AP bio class, so everyone has that kind of mindset, or it could be videography class or a video class, so everyone likes to take video, so all those people could have a similar opinion. It's not a very good selection to see what everyone thinks. Our last one is self-selected survey. In this type of survey, the participant isn't actually selected. The participant volunteers himself due to the fact that he is interested in the topic and has become aware of the issues. So go ahead and read through this, find the population, sample, and potential bias. Now that you've had time to read it, let's read it together. You saw your congresswoman on the news last night, and she was talking about an upcoming bill that she was going to vote for. She said you wanted to hear from people in her district as to what they thought of the issue. Since you know of this bill and you oppose it, you call her local office and you write her an email regarding your opposition. So the population would be anyone in that district. And the sample would be anyone who contacts her. What's the bias? Well, only people with that opinion will call, with a strong opinion will call. All right, so go ahead and go to the next page. We have another example. I want you to read it and try and find the population, sample, and bias. Let's read the example together. School board meetings are open to the public. Meeting agendas must be published at least 1 week in advance of the meeting. You happen to be on the school district website and see that a topic you are passionately in support of is going to be discussed and voted upon. You make sure that you're available to go to that meeting and voice your support. So our population would be all the people in the district again. And the sample is those who that show up to the meeting. And again, our bias, only those with strong opinions will give them. Okay, so our last type of sample or survey type. In this type of survey sample method, the population is divided into subgroups, and then random samples are taken from each group. So this one is actually good if it's done correctly. This method ensures that all subgroups are represented. Go ahead and read this scenario and find the population, sample, and bias. Now that you've had a chance to read it, let's read it together. There are 5 elementary schools which feed into the Clovis North Education Complex. Clovis North administrators wish, I think that's supposed to say wish. So go ahead and cross which to wish. To survey 100 sixth grade parents regarding the use of laptops next year when their child will be in 7th grade. The administration wants to make sure that parents from each feeder school participate in the survey. So they divide the population into the separate schools and then randomly select 20 sixth grade parents from each. So the population is who are we asking? We're asking 6th grade parents. So all 6th grade parents. And our sample is 20 parents from each school. And that makes 100 total. And there's not really any bias. We're looking at, we have from each school, we can get an idea randomly of what each school thinks. And so that's a pretty good spread to make sure that all the subgroups are represented. So this kind of a key idea is that this method ensures that all subgroups are represented. Our next topic is if something's an observational study versus an experiment. And I want us to note that both of them involve something in common. They both involve research. There's one big difference, however. In an observational study, the research is done by watching. The data is already there. So go ahead and read this let's read this example. A researcher wants to try to determine the daily routine of chimpanzees. He goes into their habitat and watches them interact throughout the day. He records his results. So keyword is he's just watching. The data is already there. The chimpanzees are already interacting. He is just watching. In an experimental study, the research is done on data that is generated from within the experiment. The experiment oftentimes has two groups, a control group and an experimental group. So a control group is the group that nothing happens to them, and the experimental group is where something happens. So let's read this example. A researcher wants to know whether or not an SAT review course is of any significant benefit. He begins a group with 50 students who receive similar scores on their first attempt. All 50 are going to take the SAT again. She has 25 take the review course, so she has a group that takes the review course and a group that does not. So the group that does not, this is our control, and this is our experimental. Improvement among the two groups is going to be analyzed. So again, this is a controlled experiment, and it goes into saying which one's the control and which one's not. Go ahead and take some time to read example 1 and 2 and answer them. Now that you've had time, for example 1, does high octane gas help your car's performance? This is the question. 20 identical trucks are used. 10 of them are filled with high octane gas for 6 months, while the other are filled with low octane gas for 6 months. After 6 months, their performance is compared. So this is an experiment because we have our two different groups, one with low and one with our high octane gas. And we're actually doing something. We're doing an experiment. We're filling them with different amounts of, or different levels of gas. For number 2, a researcher wants to find difference of behavior in friend groups at high school. She watches, keyword, the different interactions between students during lunch and records the results. Since she's watching, this is an observational study. And that is the end of 5.1.